Welcome everybody. It's great to have such an audience. I'm researching salt giants since 15 years now, and I've enjoyed lots of findings that show us that the biblical flood, really happened. So I think that's just what we are going to do now. The magmatic origin of salt is very important because it's demolishing the need for deep time. What we are going to address tonight is the biblical paradigm I adhere to, and then the magmatic origin of salt giants. And in 2021, there was a paper full of critique on my work published. And well, together with my co-writer Gert-Jan van Heugden, we prepared something to counter the critics. And just today, in the newest Journal of Creation, there you can find our countering of the critics. And I will address some points in this presentation as well. Then we will go on with Sodom and Gomorrah and the Dead Sea, because underneath the Dead Sea there is a 12 kilometer thick salt formation. So what is that doing there, and what has it to do with the biblical events? And how do theistic evolutionists go on with that such facts? And then an interesting salt formation in the United States, in Texas and New Mexico, the Castile. The Castile is in the Delaware Basin, and it has 418,000 layers. Now, how is all that will be addressed? I'm astonished, or I look forward to it. So, about my paradigm. I believe in the Bible. I believe in 6 days and about 6,000 years old Earth. I have no problem with that at all, because theology is able to show how it all fits together. And my paradigm is that on creation day 3 and 4, and it's slightly different to what I've heard from other young Earth creationists, so I have a very specific position here. But on the granite continents were made by God himself at the current locations, because I think only God can move continents over thousands of kilometers horizontally over this solid rock Earth. And he has said it in Psalm 136 that speaks about God who spread out the earth upon the waters. And I also believe that God created fresh water I believe that God created the earth from out of fresh water and also placed fresh water under the continents, containing deep sea life, because in Exodus 20 verse 4 there is written, "You shall not make for yourself an idol of what is in the water under the earth." You will understand this is very specific position I take. Genesis 7 verse 11, the springs of the great deep burst forth, and there the continent goes into 1,000 pieces. The floodwaters from beneath the continents did deposit fossiliferous mud, 5 kilometers thick in average, from 0 up to 20 kilometers thick in some places. And all these granite pieces of the continents were in between. And what you see is the starter of all this is the volcanoes underneath the water. So what we will see lots of examples in this presentation, is that you see on top of the continent, you see these yellow layers, and that's the mud that's being delivered by the flood. But underneath this continent, you see all these volcanoes. So there is a lot of magmatic activity in between all this flood mud. And then, so that was the flood. And at the end of the flood, I believe that then volcanic forces lifted up the continents, by which space was created on the edges. If you lift up a continent, then by lifting it up on the edges surrounding it, there will become space, and water and sediment will go down in there and magma will come up. And so you have what is said in Genesis 8 verse 3, the waters returned from off the earth continually. That was in the second half of the flood year. Then the continents came up and the waters returned underneath the continents. And we see the primary volcanoes lifting up the continents, and by the water intake, the rock becomes weakened and the melting point comes lower. By this system, secondary volcanoes will start. And this all explains contemporary displacements as we see today. So that's very short, my way of looking into geology. Now about the magmatic origin of salt. And this is only one example. Salt formations, the salt giants, are found all over the world and on every continent. But this is one stretched out from the United Kingdom up to Poland. It's 500,000 square kilometers of rock salt with a thickness in between 500 or 1,000 meters in average. So that's an awful lot of salt, probably 250,000 up to 500,000 cubic kilometers of salt. Now, marvel at the scientific explanation, because scientists say evaporation of seawater produces a layer of 1 kilometer of salt. Now, that's amazing, because here we look at such a basin wherein this has to happen. And before you have evaporated seawater, which is required to get this huge salt giant in the subsurface of northern Europe, you have a basin, you need a basin where continuously with ocean water, the salty ocean water goes in, becomes evaporated, and then the problem starts. Then it will seep out of the basin. That's just like a river. When a river runs into the sea, the river water will float upon the seawater. Because it's fresh water, it's less dense than the seawater. Now here we see seawater going into a basin which is more salty. That means that the water in this basin is more dense and will flow back into the ocean. That's actually what happens these days at Gibraltar from the Mediterranean Sea. There's exactly this system going on. The Mediterranean Sea is containing more dense salty water, and therefore this dense water will seep back into the Atlantic Ocean at Gibraltar. And the ocean will flow in with less salty seawater. That's the system. So it's impossible to get this 1 kilometer thick layer of salt within the basin. It just doesn't happen. And there is another problem with this system. Rock salt doesn't contain fossils, but you can see this basin is filled with life because the ocean will just deliver it. It's going to go into this basin. And there is nothing in rock salt that actually reminds us that this was a sea. So since Neptunism is clearly wrong, I think Plutonism must provide the correct answer. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks about salt like this. This is De Buur in 2019, and he writes, evaporation alone cannot explain salt deposits several kilometers thick, the salt giants. Well, I agree so far. Now, an example of the salt underneath the northeast of the Netherlands. So this is still the same salt formation stretched out from the United Kingdom into Poland. And it's also underneath the northeast of the Netherlands. This is where I live. And what we're looking at, these are salt pillars. These rise up to 3 kilometers high. Those are all covered with sand, clay, and chalk. So they are covered with flat deposits. And as you know, our country is flat, so these mountains are buried in the subsurface, but up to 3 kilometers high. This is an example of how these salt pillars are found worldwide, and there are also pillars up to 10 kilometers high. Then there is a similarity between salt and magma. And it has been recognized in 2018 by Mr. Willis, and he wrote a paper about it. And he just notes that there is a big similarity because a magma can invade in between layers and can be removed and leaving what they call now a welt. You will end up with a welt, something that can be recognized in the subsurface. And the squeezed diapirs, that is a squeezed salt pillar, that become squeezed that successfully that you will end up with a welt where there is no vertical salt anymore. And then you will end up with a pinched off salt pillar, like here is in the middle. And such a salt pillar high up in the layers can also go sideways over hundreds of kilometers. And then again, it's that liquid. It can invade and it can become removed, leaving a welt. So my conclusion is there is not only a similarity between salt welts and magma welts. This is evidence that salt actually was a magma and was mobile in between flood mud, because all the other layers are sand, clay, and chalk delivered by the flood. This is more evidence. I've showed it in 2018 as well. The hydrodynamics of two fluids, non-miscible fluids, with different densities. At the left side, you see how in a laboratory is tested how oil will float on water. And if you put them upside down, then the oil will find a way upwards very quick. So you need a high-speed camera to make this visible. At the coastline of Norway in the north, there we see 5 kilometer high salt pillars. And two of these salt pillars are remarkable equal to what we see in the test with two liquids. So what I'm showing here is evidence that the salt was a liquid, had a liquid phase and was solidifying in between liquid mud. What was the moment in history that such an amount of mud was liquid? That was during the flood. So this is quite solid evidence for the flood. And here I have a cross-section of the salt pillar underneath Gorleben. That's in Germany. And what you see here is that the top of this is quite a massive pillar. It's not only the blue one in the middle, but the green is another kind of salt that's part of the salt pillar. Then you see a light blue, more at the outer side, and then you see a white. Within that is written Z4 Altervolke. That's a kind of salt underneath Germany. So this whole mushroom is one big salt pillar. And what you see on the top of the right side of the top, you see that there is a part of this top has been turned upside down. And we talk here about several cubic kilometers of salt that's been turned upside down. This is evidence for a catastrophe. Deep time will never provide an answer to this problem. And the expansion of an escaping gas bubble has been the cause for this. That because this is 3 kilometers high, and if such a bubble of gas rises up in the liquid salt, and then on the top there is a solid, because it's becoming solid from outside, then this rising gas bubble will just turn upside down the whole top and escape, leaving the top aside. Then we have just to see what is a polystrate fossil and what is a polystrate salt pillar, because it's quite the same evidence. And Bible believers do have a strong case with polystrate fossils that prove the catastrophic deposition of flood layers, because all these flood layers must have been delivered in the time that this fossilized. And that's a short time. But the testimony of the salt of the earth is 1,000 times more powerful for it shows that all the strata have been deposited simultaneously in one great watery catastrophe. Here you see the magmatic salt solidified, what has been solidified in between the mud, the sediments of the flood. And so the salt magma interfingered with flood sediments. Okay, now countering the critiques. This has been published today in the Journal of Creation, and last year, in 2021, Blom presented a paper with all kind of critique on my work on the magmatic origin of salt. We countered the critique with the English origin of salt deposits and structures in the Journal of Creation 36, which has been published today. Now, Blom claims that salt pillars are less dense than the overburden, and that's the reason why they slowly came up during millions of years. These pillars came up in the subsurface because they are less dense. Well, let's check it out, I would say. This is Segeberg, Germany. There you see that there is a lot of anhydrite in this salt. Anhydrite is also a salt, and halite is another salt. So the anhydrite and the halite together make here the salt pillar. And anhydrite is the most dense. Well, what is it? Up to 2,900 kilograms per cubic meter, whereas the subsurface, the sedimentary rock surrounding it, well, at the top, at sea level, it's only 1,300 kilograms per cubic meter. And then it's becoming more dense when it's buried underneath 500 kilometers. When it's buried under 500 meters, then it's about 2,100 kilograms per cubic meter. So that is still less dense than the salt pillar. Blom writes in a paper, and paper, you can write everything in a paper. That's not that difficult, but the facts are contrary to what has been published by him. So he also claims salt to be ductile. Now, that is true in a way for halite. Halite is sodium chloride, and halite is ductile. That means it can move very slow in only a few centimeters per year. That is very slow. That's 100,000 times slower than a snail, I think so. So only a few centimeters per year. The high pressure over it, you can move it very, very slow. That's what we call a ductile behavior of sodium chloride. However, anhydrite is not ductile. And here you see a salt pillar where anhydrite has been the most ductile, more than halite. Now, I'm not convinced that Blom had a strong case against us. This is a bit more complicated. There's another point. Blom uses the observed behavior of viscous fluids to calculate unobserved movement of solid rocks over millions of years. Now, I doubt that that's correct. I don't think that it's a correct way of using your calculations, because a fluid is totally different from a solid rock. But okay, he starts his maths, he starts his calculation with situation C in this graph. And he starts simple with situation C. However, situation C is a miracle. Why is that? Because you start with situation A, the initial situation. There you see there is an undisturbed subsalt rock overlain by an undisturbed salt layer, overlain by undisturbed overburden 3 kilometer thick. Well, that's easy. That's how it must have started then, this salt pillar rising. And then we go to B. There's applied an extension to the overburden only. Suddenly there is a graben, a rift zone, 3 kilometer wide, with underneath it there's still the undisturbed salt layer 1 kilometer thick, and there's still the undisturbed subsalt rock. So somehow, on a miracle way, this overburden has been pulled aside. Well, that's a miracle. And then the situation C, then the salt pillar starts to grow because it's been differential loaded. So from a far side, to 25 kilometers or even hundreds of kilometers away, this salt starts to move underneath the overburden. And Blom, he thought the walls of the graben will be collapsed. So this was his starting point. And now he starts to do calculations with differential loaded salt. It's a miracle to come here, but also C is a miracle because the overburden will not only collapse, not only the wall will collapse, but the whole overburden itself will flow because it's founded on this salt. So as soon as the salt starts to move, overburden will go with it. The overburden itself will go into the graben, not just the salt. So he's wrong. Situation C is a miracle. Then another thing, his calculations are based on viscous fluids. Well, sorry, but we are talking about solid rock, so that's not possible. Then he calculates that his pillar rises in a tempo of 500 meters per million year. Well, that's impossible because this Earth is 6,000 years old, so this doesn't help. Now we go to the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah. We see there up to 12 kilometers salt underneath the Dead Sea in a region 20 by 80 kilometers. For evolutionists, their proposition is that there was a water level of 700 kilometers that's been evaporated during millions and millions of years. Or, what I would say, this salt have a magmatic origin. So, and you see the Mount Sodom at the south side of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is 400 meters below sea level, and Mount Sodom arises 300 meters above the Dead Sea. And I think the Bible clearly claims a catastrophic origin for this. And just to list the biblical events around Sodom and Gomorrah, I start with the flood, because I believe that the Jordan River Valley was already formed during the flood. And also the magmatic rock, because there was a 12 kilometer thick layer of rock there. I think it was completely covered by sedimentary rock at the end of the flood. But Mount Sodom wasn't there. Why can I be so strong on that? Because Lot could choose the plain of Jordan, which was well watered. Well, if there is a lot of water and there is a salt mountain, Mount Sodom, because it's pure salt, then it's not a fresh water area, but it becomes salty water area. So I'm pretty sure that Mount Sodom wasn't there at that moment in time. This is in Genesis 30. Then later on, the Bible gives away another piece of information. The heat of the salt had converted the buried organic matter into tar during the flood, because that's what happened during the flood. We had all these flood sediments that buried organic matter, and in between all this magmatic material, all this solidifying material, all the heat transferred organic matter into gas, oil, coal, and tar. This tar sits in the subsurface, but as it floats upon water, then the groundwater will slowly move it upwards through the sedimentary rock. And therefore, the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits in Genesis 14. And then later on, an additional eruption of salt lava caused the destruction of the cities, formed Mount Sodom, and ruined the area forever. Abraham saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. So this was an additional eruption of salt. Only a small eruption was required to destroy the cities and the area. Now, how will deep time cope with these biblical events around Sodom and Gomorrah? As evolutionists believe that in the last 3.5 million years, seawater has been evaporated in this area, by which the salt volume out of this water sinked away to a depth of 12 kilometers. Therefore, theistic evolutionists do not believe that the whole plain of Jordan was well watered with fresh water in the days of Abraham. Also, it was impossible to build towns in there. So they oppose the Old and the New Testament. In the New Testament, Peter writes about the cities. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, it's clear that evolutionists do have a problem with the biblical history and also with the New Testament about this. So it's not only the flood, they need to cut out creation out of the Bible. The flood must be taken out, but now Abraham must be taken out as well, and Sodom and Gomorrah and everything. Now we go to the English origin of the layered Castile, a very specific salt rock. But remember, salt has many faces, many kinds of salts are all salt rock. And this is more anhydrite and calcite. And I had a rebuttal with Dr. Kevin Henke via YouTube channel Standing for Truth that has to say that Dr. Kevin Henke brought his opinion via an atheistic channel, and I brought my opinion via Standing for Truth. So it was not a face-to-face rebuttal. But about the origin of all these layers in the Castile. And we see here an alternation of anhydrite and calcite. And note also the cracks in the anhydrite layers. I will come back on these cracks later. Because anhydrite is not ductile. So when the subsurface moves, then we will see cracks. Now, marvel at a scientific explanation. Ocean water holds 0.021 grams calcium sulfate per liter. This is nearly nothing compared to sodium chloride. Sodium chloride has about 15 times more grams per liter. This ocean water seeps through a reef. That's their opinion. It seeps through a reef from the ocean into the basin, the Castile basin, of the Delaware basin. And in the basin, these Castile laminae starts to form underneath hundreds meters of water. In the basin, that water evaporates partly until calcium carbonate and gypsum, calcium sulfate with water in it. There is crystal water still in the gypsum, has been deposited in the basin. And obviously, this water becomes oversaturated with sodium chloride, because sodium chloride, that's the main salt in ocean water. And that becomes oversaturated at 359 grams per liter. But that's not in the Castile. Well, hardly not. There is some, but there is hardly no sodium chloride in this Castile laminae, in between the Castile laminae. So what happens? Where is the sodium chloride? Well, the theory is it must have seeped out. We call that a reflux. It has been seeping out through the reef back into the ocean. That's a miracle, because that water has a higher viscosity. It also has a larger distance to pass through the reef. So it's really a mystery. And this miraculous process also repeats 209,000 years to form the Castile. And in all this time, it was already killed. In the discussion, they told me, no, this was a dead reef. So there was a dead reef sitting during 209,000 years, and the dead reef has not been eroded in all this time. It really is amazing. This is absolutely storytelling, but this is, this is science. There's very good evidence for how this formation came into being. Now, Ord, in a paper in 2009, was absolutely right to question if there is any valid reason why 0.65% of all ocean water would end up in the Delaware basin, because to get all this anhydrite in there, you need loads and loads of ocean water, and it would all end up in the Delaware basin in an evaporation process. Well, it's amazing. Now, there is a lot of oil in this area. So despite of 50,000 exploration plus hundreds of thousands of development wells, it's amazing how many wells are there in the area. Then a scholar writes in 2007, In spite of all this research, few areas have more unresolved geological controversies than the Permian Reef complex. And that's talking about the Delaware Basin, the Castile inside. And yeah, I agree. I think for their perspective, it's it's only they only have controversies and they don't have answers. So evolution theory does not at all provide a solid explanation for the Castile. Now, crystallizing in layers, like in the Castile and in other salt giants, is quite normal in layered igneous intrusions. It happens everywhere. By example, the Zechstein salt. The Zechstein salt, that's the salt formation in northern Europe. I showed it already, but in here at the right side, this is a core that I visited in a core house here in the Netherlands. And you see all these layers. And I have also an example from a layered igneous intrusion and not salt. That's the Bushveld chromatite. There you clearly see the layering. And flow banding is a geological term to describe bands or layers that can sometimes be seen in rock that formed from magma. And that's a flow banded rhyolite at the left side. And that's not a salt. Then in the middle, you see a salt outcrop in Cordona in Spain. And at the right side, here in the Netherlands, we have this core out of the Zechstein, and you see a layering. So I don't think we have a problem with the layering. To understand the layering from a magmatic origin is quite normal. But I would like to address the anhydrite as well. The Castile is mostly anhydrite, which is calcium sulfate, but that's a dehydrated gypsum. Now, evaporation model and the evaporation process is delivering gypsum into a basin, not anhydrite. When you evaporate, you start with gypsum. Gypsum is delivered out of the water. And then you run into troubles because plasterboard is made from gypsum. It's used in building, partly because of its flame retardant effect. And gypsum is a very stable crystal in desert environments. And in laboratory work, Hardy in 1967, he writes, the scarcity of anhydrite in modern evaporite deposits is predicted by the present results in his lab. It's not easy to transfer from gypsum to anhydrite, but it's anhydrite that sits in the Castile. And to continue this question, transforming gypsum into anhydrite plus water, because that's what happens. If you transform gypsum to anhydrite, then there is a release of water. And that together causes a total volume increase of 10%. So if you have 1 mole of gypsum, one amount of gypsum, well, we call it a 1 mole, and you transfer that to calcium sulfate, to anhydrite, then you will get 1 mole of calcium sulfate and 2 mole of water, because there are 2 water molecules in this crystal. And these two together, 1 mole calcium sulfate and 2 mole water, this volume is 10% more than the original 1 mole gypsum. So gypsum and desert roses hold their crystal water in the desert. And there's no problem. You can lay it in the sun, in the heat of the sun, and it will still stay gypsum. But scientists, geologists especially, they think that gypsum and desert roses will release their crystal water when you bring them down in water. You go down with your gypsum and desert roses, when you bring it down under hundreds of meters of water, then it will dewater. But that's astonishing, that's amazing, because there the pressure is higher, it's also colder and water, and the pressure is higher. So the pressure is higher, that means that the volume will decrease. However, dewatering means increase of volumes. So do you see the problem? And underneath the water, there's colder. So dewatering is not possible in the heat of the desert, but it's better possible underneath 100 meters of water where it's colder. But it's also wetter, where all these 3 factors will inhibit conversion to anhydrite. It's just not going to happen. So geologists do have a serious problem here. Now, There's also oil in the Castile. Now that's a difficulty because oil will not survive heating above 200 degrees Celsius. But still, it doesn't contradict with an igneous origin, as simple as it is, because it's secondary. It's secondary oil. It's not primary oil that sits in the Castile. It floats in after, just like the tar in the Dead Sea that rises up slowly. That's what happens with all oil. It is secondary, entering the Castile by all the cracks in the Castile, because anhydrite is not having any ductile behavior. So when the subsurface is on the move for whatever reason, then the cracks will allow the oil to seep in. And what do we see there? There is an awful lot of oil in that area, but the Castile has accounted for less than 0.01% of the oil in the region. So what about oil? Oil is not a problem. It's just a secondary thing. The Castile is just reservoir rock for oil that seeps up from the underlying sedimentary flood deposits. So you have this, the source rock for the oil is in the subsurface, hidden underneath the Castile, and the Castile itself is just reservoir rock. And so the current day's existence of oil shows only that the temperature didn't exceed 200 degrees Celsius after the oil arrived. So it's not contradictory to a magmatic origin. So, well, my recommendation to science is that please use your budget and your tooling and do some, you've got some work to do. Scientists should do tests with ionic liquids. Because that's what salt is. When you melt salt, then it's a liquid. It's an ionic liquid. Now we know salt is an ionic solid, but if you melt it, it becomes an ionic liquid. And they should do tests with ionic liquids to get a better understanding of the solidification process. If anyone wants more on salt, that's possible on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, on other YouTube channels as well, like Standing for Truth and some other channels, and ResearchGates. I have a page over there. There you can see all my peer-reviewed publications. If there are remaining questions after this this presentation and after the question time, then you can also send me an email. I would happily answer them. And if someone wants my presentation because you yourself want to give this presentation in your own church or school or whatever, then please send me an email. I'm happy to share this with you guys. And if someone wants to help me with my further research on salt, then also please let me know. And I hope you could understand my presentation.